Paleontology as a science often involves a lot of detective work, figuring out what a long extinct organism may have looked like and how it might have lived from incomplete fossil remains. But sometimes we get very lucky and the fossil record provides some truly astonishing insights into the past life on our planet. One of these fortunate instances occurred with the discovery of the stunning specimen of an armored ankylosaurian dinosaur named Borealopelta. This dinosaur has a large part of its body preserved in articulation, with a complete head, most of the trunk and hip region, a complete right forelimb, parts of the left, and extensive armor as well as some soft tissue preserved. The exceptional 3D preservation of this specimen makes it look as though this animal is just sleeping there, ready to wake up at any moment. And yet, this fossil is over 100 million years old. The large size of this fossil and the degree to which it's been preserved makes Borealipelter a particularly stunning fossil, and the study of this dinosaur has enabled us to learn so much about how these fascinating creatures once lived. This specimen is so well preserved that even the colour of this dinosaur has been able to be reconstructed, and since so much of the external body armour is also there, it means Borealipelter is quite possibly the most accurately reconstructed ankylosaur ever. People really seem to enjoy my video on the most accurately reconstructed dinosaur ever, Psittacosaurus, and so I thought it would be cool to continue these videos as a sort of series. Please do let me know in the comments if you have even more suggestions for more accurately reconstructed extinct animals. Anyway, Borealipelter was first uncovered back in 2011 when workers at a mine operated by the petroleum company Suncor Energy found something unusual embedded in one of the cliffs they had excavated. The mine itself is located 30 kilometers to the north of Fort McMurray in Alberta, Canada, and was being dug into for the early Cretaceous-aged sandy sediments rich in bitumen. Upon realizing that they'd found the fossil of a large prehistoric creature, the mine legally had to contact the Royal Tyrrell Museum based in Drumheller, Alberta, as the discovery had to be protected under the terms of the company's permit. Paleontologists from the museum soon arrived on the scene, where they were expecting to find that the remains of a large prehistoric marine reptile such as a plesiosaur or an ichthyosaur had been found, since these were marine sediments. But after figuring out that they were not dealing with a marine reptile, they realized that this was a dinosaur, an ankylosaur, which had apparently been washed out to sea all those millions of years ago. Unfortunately, the excavating machinery had already dug part way into the fossil, resulting in half of it being smashed into several blocks on the ground, while the rest of the specimen was still embedded 8 meters above the mine's floor in the cliff. So, a week later, a 2-week-long excavation overseen by the paleontologists began, to retrieve the rest of the ankylosaur. Eventually, the remaining parts of the skeleton were removed from the cliff, using massive mining machinery and many hours of hard work, but not without a slight disaster. As seen in the documentary Dinosaur Cold Case, which recorded parts of the excavation, the large block containing the remaining parts of the ankylosaur was plaster jacketed, and then they attempted to lift it using one of the mining vehicles. However, as it was pulled up by 2 supporting beams underneath, it shattered down the middle, spilling the broken contents. Now, I can speak from personal experience here when I say how heartbreaking this is. A very similar thing actually happened during our South Africa expedition, which you may have seen some videos of, while we were trying to lift a plaster jacket containing the bones of a much older prehistoric animal called Lystrosaurus. As you'll see in the next episode we have coming out hopefully fairly soon, the whole thing crumbled right before our eyes, and it was absolutely awful to watch. So I can imagine just how devastating it must have been to watch Borealipelter fall apart like that. Fortunately, both in the case of our Lystrosaurus fossils and Borealipelter, things turned out alright in the end. Once the ankylosaur was back at the Royal Tyrrell Museum, the many blocks containing the bones were reassembled, and museum technician Mark Mitchell then spent the next 6 years painstakingly removing the surrounding rock and freeing the specimen, revealing an absolutely astonishing ankylosaur fossil. I was actually very lucky to see Borealipelter as it was still being prepared at the Royal Tyrrell Museum when I visited in 2015. And even back then, it was an incredible sight. I couldn't believe how lifelike it still looked over 100 million years after it died, and the skill involved with the preparation of the fossil was just astounding. Then I got to visit the museum again 2 years later, when they had the ankylosaur fully prepared and on display in a beautiful case in the middle of their new exhibition, and again I was struck by how incredible this fossil is. The week that I visited, in late July of 2017, also happened to be the week that this ankylosaur was at last given a name and scientifically described, and the world welcomed Borealipelter markmitchelli. The genus name Borealopelta comes from the combined Latin and Greek for northern shield, a perfect name for this shielded reptile found in the north of Alberta. The species name, markmitchelli, is in honour of Mark Mitchell and his tireless efforts to prepare this incredible specimen, which the paper actually says took him over 7,000 hours, so absolutely very deserving of the name. This 2017 paper described in detail all of the preserved anatomy of Borealipelter, going over the exceptional 3D preservation of the armour, the anatomy of the skull and limbs, and the pelvis. It also briefly explains how it came to be preserved, being washed out to sea and ending up sinking to the sea floor on its back, and describes how the impact of the carcass on the seabed actually deformed some of the underlying sediment. The fossil shows that the snout is relatively narrow, and the upper and side surfaces of the skull are covered in dermal plates and then overlain by epidermal scales. A large horn projects out over the tops of the eyes, forming a ridge and then meeting another horn behind it that projects out and tapers to a blunt tip. The neck has 3 distinct bands of armour running down its length, known as half rings, with 6 large projecting osteoderms, the technical name for bones that form in the skin, on each band, that increase in size further back and closer to the main body. The projections along the sides of the animal are also larger than those towards the midline, and at the sides they become modified into spines. Between the bands of large osteoderms, there are multiple rows of much smaller, very tightly packed scales enabling more flexibility in the neck. The main body preserves a transitional band just behind the neck, and then 12 bands in the thoracic region, behind which are at least 8 bands in the sacral region. Again, the osteoderms on these bands increase in size and length towards the lateral sides of the ankylosaur, becoming modified into spines. And there is a pair of particularly large shoulder spines on the first of the thoracic bands. Between the thoracic bands, there are also rows of much smaller basement scales. However, unlike in the neck, these thoracic rows comprise single lines of subrectangular scales. The sacral region of the dinosaur, that is, around the hip, then has bands of large octagonal scales and overlying osteoderms, separated by smaller diamond-shaped scales. The partially preserved forelimbs also show ovoid osteoderms on the upper parts, while a pair of larger conical osteoderms project backwards lower down near the elbow joint. Unfortunately, the tail of Borealipelter is not preserved, but based on comparisons with relatives, a good estimate of what it probably looked like can be made. The classification of the ankylosaur was also investigated, finding it to be most closely related to Porposaurus found in Texas, and Europelter known from Spain. Hungarosaurus from Hungary was also found to be fairly closely related. Borealipelter was also therefore officially recognized as a nodosaurid, one of the 2 traditional branches of the ankylosaur evolutionary tree. While the ankylosaurids are well known for possessing those famous tail clubs, nodosaurids lacked them, and there are of course many other differences between the groups too. However, I should also quickly note that a very recent paper has cast doubt on the Ankylosaurian dichotomy, finding that things are actually more complicated and that the nodosaurids should be split up into the Polacanthids, Struthiosaurids, and Panoplosaurids. In this new classification, Borealipelter actually comes out either as a Struthiosaurid or even as an early diverging Ankylosaurid. But its classification is actually ironically complicated by the fact that its preservation is so good, meaning that the skeletal anatomy underneath its external armour, which is most useful for comparisons with other ankylosaurs, is obscured. So it remains to be seen if future studies might clarify its evolutionary position eventually. For now though, I'll continue to call it a nodosaurid for simplicity. But anyway, one of the other main focuses of this 2017 paper was to look at the colour of this dinosaur. The exceptional preservation of the fossil meant that layers of organic residue were preserved across some of the scales and bony armour, and within these, the paleontologists identified the presence of the pigment melanin through the use of mass spectroscopic analyses of the residues. The presence of this pigment and the investigation of the distribution of it across Borealipelter's body meant that a reconstruction of the dinosaur's colours could be made. Evidence for the presence of a specific kind of melanin, called pheomelanin, was detected in the analyses, and from this the researchers were able to tell that Borealipelter was mostly a reddish-brown colour. The bony armour and projecting spines would have been covered in keratinous sheaths in life, and traces of these sheaths are preserved, and show that they were heavily pigmented in life, and so they would have looked quite dark. The largest of the armor spines, though, the parascapular spines near the shoulders, were much lighter in colour, with lower melanin concentrations in the keratinous sheaths. An interesting difference that might have something to do with a sexual display function. Another very interesting discovery made about the coloration of this ankylosaur is the fact that it was countershaded, a term meaning the underside of the animal was lighter than the upper surface. The transition from dark to lighter colours can be observed in the organic film, where it's preserved in cross-section views of the hip region and the neck, showing that the body changes from being highly pigmented on top to much less pigmented on the flanks. Now, if you've seen the Psittacosaurus video, then you already know that countershading is a pretty common colour scheme across many different groups of vertebrates, as it aids in making an animal harder to see by breaking up its outline when there's light shining down on its back. It was also recognised in that Psittacosaurus specimen itself, and that's probably not too much of a surprise considering it's a small dinosaur that was probably on the menu for a lot of predatory animals. Therefore, cryptic coloration would have increased its chances of survival. What is slightly surprising though is the presence of crypsis in a heavily armoured animal the size of Borealipelter. The dinosaur would have been about 5.5 meters or 18 feet long and had a mass of at least 1.3 metric tons, and yet there were apparently still selection pressures acting on it that resulted in a countershaded colour scheme. Coupled with the extensive bony armour, this shows that the Cretaceous world that Borealopelta and other ankylosaurs inhabited must have been a pretty terrifying place to live at times, with large terrestrial predators that would still have apparently targeted such massive herbivores. Whereas today, generally, larger mammalian herbivores do not display countershading, while smaller ones do, as they are less at risk of predation at these bigger body sizes, back in the Cretaceous, these massive dinosaurs were seemingly still at risk from attack by large theropods. Some incredible insights into the Mesozoic world have been obtained from this spectacular specimen then. Another study published later in 2017 looked more at the anatomy and growth of the armor spines of Borealipelter. Since many of the keratinous extensions to the bony cores of the spines and osteoderms are preserved in this specimen, the relationships between how these cores and their outer coverings grew relative to each other could be investigated. What they found was that these structures showed positive allometry, meaning that in the smaller spines and osteoderms, the keratinous sheath was smaller and more subtle, while in the larger spines, the keratinous sheath was even more extensive, exaggerating the total length of the structures by a much higher proportion than in the smaller ones. This was taken to an extreme in those large parascapular spines by the shoulders, which already had long bony cores but were made to look even more exaggerated by the sheaths. Coupled with the fact that they were apparently lighter in colour than the other spines, it seems to be more good evidence that there was a socio-sexual selection pressure to extend these spines as display structures, basically making the individual look more attractive to potential mates. Further investigation of how Borealipelter came to be so exceptionally well preserved was then published. And this paper is actually quite a special one for the channel, as this research is actually one of the news stories we reported on in the first ever episode of 7 Days of Science, all the way back in February of 2018. This paper explained how there was a strangely common occurrence of ankylosaur fossils being found upside down in relation to the stratigraphy of the sediments they're preserved in, notably in the case of Borealipelter, but also with many other ankylosaur specimens found in Canada. This had been noted before by paleontologists, and ideas were offered to explain the phenomenon, but this study properly tested and quantified the occurrences and hypotheses for the first time. They discovered that there was indeed strong statistical support for ankylosaurs being discovered upside down more commonly than right side up, in the sample of 36 specimens from Alberta that they looked at, and found that the best supported explanation was one they charmingly called the bloat and float model. It seems that the upside-down carcasses occurred when dead ankylosaurs became washed out into river or marine settings and then bloated due to the buildup of gases, overturning their bodies as the heavy dorsal armour weighed the back down while the bloated belly caused them to float. Then, once degassing happened, the heavy dorsal armour caused the bodies to sink and become preserved in sediments upside down. There's also an interesting bias in the fossil record in that nodosaurids turn up in marine sediments much more often than ankylosaurids do, which the study also suggests some explanations for. Looking at cross-sections through the body of these dinosaurs, they found that nodosaurids tend to be generally more susceptible to turning over in the water than ankylosaurids are, even when they're alive. Therefore, nodosaurids wading in shallower waters were much more likely to be overturned and swept out to sea. Additionally, the tail clubs of Ankylosaurids would have weighed the tails down further than in the clubless tails of nodosaurids, increasing the chances of the club becoming tangled in something, such as vegetation or channel lag, and stopping the Ankylosaurid carcass from being washed out to sea. There's also another hypothesis offered in an older paper explaining that there's a 10 million year gap of Ankylosaurids in certain North American deposits, while nodosaurids are quite common at that time, so the nodosaur bias probably has something to do with that as well. The 2018 study also offers the bloat and float hypothesis as an explanation for the frequency of glyptodont fossils being found upside down too, armoured armadillo relatives that lived from the Eocene to Pleistocene, and which also have dorsal armour that would have made them susceptible to flipping over in water. The bloat and float hypothesis has been somewhat disputed by a different group of paleontologists though, with them saying that the study miscalculated the specific gravities of ankylosaurs and made them too low, not taking into account the densities of all the small scutes and armour. As such, they find it unlikely that the ankylosaurs would ever float, but still accept that the heavier dorsal armour would result in flipping in the water, but more likely when the body was near the seafloor anyway. Or if a body on land were swept into the water, then it would immediately flip due to the heavier back, without any bloating or floating necessarily being an important factor. Perhaps one way to test this could be to try and examine the previously mentioned impact on the sediment caused by the body to see if the speed at which the body hit the seafloor could be calculated. Either way though, poor old Borealipelter probably found itself swept out to sea, possibly alive, though not for long, and then may have bloated and floated once dead, eventually sinking down into the murky depths of the Cretaceous Ocean. Or it might have already been near the bottom. In both cases though, it was then quickly entombed by sediment, and thanks to the relatively quick formation of a siderite concretion around the carcass, scavenging was prevented and exceptional preservation could take place. It's a sad way to go, but it did give us one of the most spectacular dinosaur fossils ever. And that exceptional preservation means we can even see what the last meal of this dinosaur was, as a mass within the abdominal cavity of this ankylosaur preserves the remains of plants that this animal had been munching on just before it died. This fossilized mass of gut contents, technically called a colalite, is made up mostly of leaf tissue, but also contains stems, bits of wood, and, very interestingly, charcoal. The incredible preservation of these stomach contents means that this is actually one of the best and most detailed looks at the direct evidence of a plant-eating dinosaur's diet, and allows for a pretty amazing reconstruction of this animal's ecology and behaviours. Of course, it's important to remember that this is based just on a single individual of the species, and the ingestion of the plant matter only represents a single event over a very short time period, and so seasonal variation in diet should also be considered. Nevertheless, analysis of the colalite shows that this Borealipelter was very selective about what it was eating, consistent with previous ideas about nodosaur diets, since their snouts were quite narrow compared to the wider and presumably more generalist ankylosaurids. More than 80% of the leaf material in the colalite came from ferns, suggesting that Borealipelter was specifically feeding on these plants, whereas there were only a few traces of other plants such as cycads and conifers, and very few traces of flowering plants, so Borealipelter apparently had a favourite food. Those charcoal fragments in the colalite also have some interesting implications, and its abundance suggests that this ankylosaur was eating quite a lot of burnt plant matter. Although it can't be said for sure if it was deliberate or by accident, it does show that this Borealipelter had been feeding in an area that had recently experienced a wildfire. There is indeed evidence that the conifer-dominated forests of the early Cretaceous world were subject to common wildfires, and considering that ferns today are an important plant in post-fire succession stages as forests recover from fires, it makes sense that the ankylosaur's gut contents would contain so much fern material. Perhaps, therefore, forests that were in the process of recovering from fires and were therefore dominated by ferns acted as niches specifically favoured by some low-browsing dinosaurs such as ankylosaurs. We see this sort of habitat preference in some modern mammal species too, with hoofed mammals making the most of recently burnt forests to feed on plants that comprise the post-fire succession. It's very interesting to think that ankylosaurs might have been doing a similar thing millions of years ago, and the fact that this Borealipelter fossil can tell us this is absolutely amazing. This behaviour was actually brought to life in the first season of Prehistoric Planet, where we see the ankylosaurid Anodontosaurus returning to a recently burned forest in order to deliberately feed on charcoal. It's said to be doing this so that the charcoal binds to the plant toxins in its stomach, neutralising them. Pretty cool to see this bit of behaviour reconstructed based on a real fossil. The plant matter in the stomach of this Borealipelter can also be used to show at what time of year this dinosaur died. Looking at cross-sections of woody stems found in the colalite, the growth rings indicate that it was eaten midway through the growing season, so probably in late springtime to mid-summertime. And considering that the Ankylosaur must have died very soon after eating these plants, it must have died between spring and midsummer too. These findings were further backed up by another study published in 2023, comparing the stomach contents of Borealipelter to the plants that would have been available to it. The Gates Formation of Alberta dates back to the same time as the marine formation that the Ankylosaur was uncovered in, but represents a more terrestrial setting with a slight marine influence, so probably estuarine and shoreline environments. Since it dates to the same time and is relatively geographically close to where Borealipelter was found, it's therefore probable that it represents the likely environment that the Ankylosaur actually inhabited when it was alive and before it got lost at sea. By surveying the plant fossils that are known from the Gates Formation, paleontologists were able to see which types of vegetation would have been available to Borealipelter, and what sorts of plants were most common here. As it turns out, the dominant plants were conifers, at 44 to 70% of the flora across all sites. Ferns were still fairly common, but significantly less abundant, at 14% or less. Other less abundant plants included ginkgos, while cycads, horsetails, and other now extinct lineages of plants were present but quite rare. So, making a comparison between the plants that these ankylosaurs had the option of eating versus what was actually in the colalite, the paleontologists again found that Borealipelter was likely quite a selective feeder, eating mainly ferns and apparently avoiding the more common conifers. This could also again mean that the ferns had become super abundant in the wake of a forest fire, and the papers support the interpretation of nodosaurs potentially deliberately feeding in recovering forests, as this would provide a sustainable source of nutrition for these low-browsing animals. So not only has the incredible Borealipelter fossil enabled us to see the exact distribution of osteoderms and armoured spikes across the dorsal surface, the extent of their keratin sheaths, and the colours of this organism, but the exceptional preservation of the Ankylosaur's last meal even allows a surprisingly good reconstruction of its dietary habits and potential behaviours. In addition, the presence of countershading in this massive animal allows for some tentative reconstructions of its trophic interactions, suggesting that Borealipelter was still hunted by large theropods. This has to be one of my favourite fossils ever, and I hope you've noticed my collector model of it that's been in the background this whole episode, and I feel so lucky that I've been able to see this specimen twice myself. I really hope I get to go back to the Royal Tyrrell Museum at some point and see it again, and I can't wait for future studies to tell us even more about the paleobiology of this incredible dinosaur. Anyway, thank you for watching, and a big thank you to our Patreon supporters, especially our dinosaur tier supporters, Amanda von Nordek, Archianthus, Clara Middleton, Daniel Ingraham, Dhruv Shrivastava, Gary Arrington, Giortist, Greg Silvernail, Corey Peterson, Loxypoo, Mark Nevin, Mendicant Fryer, Mike Pace, Monitor Man, Persian Boy, Ralph Balzac, Robert Thomas, and Steve Bradshaw. If you would like to find out more about our world, its history, and the wonderful life that surrounds us all, please feel free to subscribe to the channel if you think we deserve it, and if you would like to see more from us.